Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anders, and unless you've been living under a rock, you're well aware that Masters 2 in Reykjavik, Iceland is now just in only 6 days. In this video, I'm going to be diving into an archetypal analysis of all of the regions that will be competing based off of what we saw from them in their Challengers 2 regional finals. Let's jump right into it. To stage set a little bit, there's already a lot of content that's either already out or going to be coming out in the next couple of days that covers almost everything you can imagine about the teams that we're going to see, whether that be their play styles, the expected performance of their players, or in this particular case, the metagame that we expect to see them display. Now, it would be one thing to just show you the top 5 compositions from each of these major regions, or to show you the compositions that the teams themselves play, but I want to go a level deeper than that and instead dive into the overarching ecosystem that each of these teams was born out of. And for that, the first thing that I want to do in this video is establish a baseline of what the most prevalent compositional archetypes are on a global basis. A lot of these will be familiar to longtime followers of my content. I use many of these terms recurringly when talking about the metagame, so let's dive right in. The first archetype I want to tackle here is Classic EU Standard. This is going to be a single duelist standard with Sage and an entry by proxy initiator slot that's shared by Sova and Sky. Broadly speaking, when I'm talking about a standard composition, I'm going to mean something that has that EBP initiator, that's Sova, that Sky, as well as a controller and a sentinel that's then married to 2 flex slots. In this case, a Sage takes up one of them and a duelist picks up the other, but we'll see that standard format used a few more times here. Next up, we have Korean Standard, again using that EBP slot, in this case a dedicated Sova, with a controller and a sentinel, but then it also brings in the classic single supported dive that was popularized by Vision Strikers back in the day when it was early beta. On a more abstract basis, the description of this archetype is a single duelist standard with a mandatory dive duelist and a flash initiator slot supplementing the standard core. Next up, we'll have our first non-standard composition, and that's going to be entry by proxy mid-range, the setup that's been popularized by Fnatic and a couple other European teams, and many have referred to it as an information comp or a drone comp. The archetype is defined by a triple entry by proxy core with a controller and then a full flexible optioned 5th slot. You'll notice that if you take this, you will have direct archetypal overlap with the Korean standard that we just looked at. In Korean standard, you have this Sova, you have a flash initiator, which could be this Sky, you have a dive duelist, which could be this Raze, a controller, and then if you filled the 5th option slot here with a sentinel, you literally just have a sub-archetype of Korean standard. For our purposes, I decided that it was necessary to make the distinction between this composition and a Korean standard. In all cases that we see this setup with that Sentinel 5th slot, I will categorize it as EBP midrange, not as Korean standard, because of how differently it plays. Moving past that, we have what is probably the most infamous culprit, and that's NA standard, which is quite literally just double duelist standard. A pair of duelists with a Sova, controller, and sentinel. Next up, we have Double Dive, which, similarly to the situation with EBP midrange and Korean standard, is actually just a sub-archetype of North American standard. Instead of having Sova strictly as the initiator, it opens that category more broadly to enable for flashes in a Sky or a Breach, and it isolates both duelist slots into a mandatory Jet and Raze, the 2 dive elements of the comp. Again, I'm making this distinction because of inherent playstyle differences that it has with all other North American standard setups, but the key thing to remember moving forward here is that there is technically category overlap between the two, but in any case where there would be overlap, it will be listed strictly as Double Dive. Moving along, we have Triple Duelist, which, unsurprisingly, has 3 duelists, and the other 2 slots are full options. We saw some very early experimentation with this kind of composition from teams like TSM, and it's fallen mostly by the wayside, but there are still vestiges of it here and there, so it is part of the mix. Likewise, we have No Duelist, which has no duelists. This one was really brought into the limelight by Ninjas in Pajamas, and similar to its Triple Duelist counterpart, has kind of fallen by the wayside since. Nonetheless, it's a necessary part of the blend to make the distinctions we want between archetypes. Finally, we've got the last one, which is probably the one that's gotten the most conversation leading into Iceland, and that is Astra Viper Control. Compositionally, it's a little tricky because the only real set elements are the Astra Viper and single duelist, but there is a bit of rhyme and reason to the other two slots as well, with one being a bit of a dedicated support that's either a sage or an initiator, and the other one being either a duelist or sentinel, depending on which direction the team wants to swing, whether that be into an aggressive tendency or a defensive one. Listing them top to bottom, these are the archetypes that we'll be working with through the rest of this analysis, and while they aren't all-encompassing in terms of capturing 100% of the metagames, they are very much so the ones that capture the most of what I could come up with. There will be a lingering other category though, and that will mostly consist of double controller, double duelist, Sova configurations, as well as standard variants that drop Sova because they're being used on split. The only reason I don't have those listed as explicit archetypes is they appear in such sporadic and limited numbers that trying to make them part of a core analysis is just going to end up being a fool's errand. Expanding on this list a little bit as a last minute reminder, we do have those two categories that are subcategories in some instances. EBP midrange being a subcategory of Korean Standard when it uses a Sentinel, and Double Dive being a subcategory of North American Standard when running with a Sova. In both of those instances, if there would have been overlap, they will always default to the more specific of the two categories. So that will be the EBP midrange or the Double Dive. Now that we have that groundwork set, we have a great idea of where we want to go with this, but there's still one big question mark overhanging it all. And that's that there were a lot of white class icons in those archetypes and not so many agent pictures, so what agents were being picked inside each of those silos? Let's take a look. To start with duelists, we have a simple grid here that has every region that will be represented at Iceland, as well as every duelist in the game, and then we have the ranks at which those agents were picked within the duelist role in their respective regions. There are a few interesting points to be made here, the first of which is that Jet and Raze trade blows on whether they take the first or second slot in every single region. Phoenix and Reyna have a similar duel for the third and fourth slots, with the sole exception being the fact that Latin America actually plays Yoru. If we swing over to Sentinels, it's a lot less exciting. Killjoy has a more or less death grip on the category, with Cypher falling significantly by the wayside, and even Sage, who many people wouldn't categorize in the same traditional Sentinel niche as a Cypher or a Killjoy, is outpacing Cypher as well in most regions. Looking at initiators, it's even less exciting, if that was possible, because unsurprisingly, Sova is the most picked agent in the game and is the most picked initiator across the board. The one point that is kind of noteworthy in this category is that in spite of Breach seeing some really significant play over in Europe and being a very prevalent pickup during the beta phases of the game, he's now fallen fairly significantly behind Sky in every region except for Latin America. Now we get to what I personally think is the most interesting of the mix, and that's going to be the controllers. As you can see, this is almost a complete free-for-all. The only thing that regions can seem to agree on is the fact that Brimstone ain't it. You have Brazil, who's still heavily favoring Omen and somewhat neglecting Astra in their overarching metagame. You've got Europe, where somehow Viper has pulled into the top slot as a controller. Japan, who follows suit with the same model as Brazil. Korea, who is still prioritizing Omen more than anybody else, but is starting to dip deeper into Astra. And then you have LATAM, North America, and Southeast Asia that are all running Astra at the top of the pecking order. The dynamics surrounding how each region plays around their controllers is going to be one of the single most exciting things that we get to see at Reykjavik. That will settle us for all of the major role silos, so now we not only have a listing of major archetypes that we understand and expect to see, but also the way that the agents are going to fill out those archetypes. So at long last, we can get into the exciting stuff, which is looking at each region's archetypal metagame leading into Masters. Starting with Brazil, we see that they have a fairly small metagame segment taken up by EU Standard and Korean Standard, with a massive almost 50% being North American Standard and Archetype. They have a little bit more added to that pool further in Double Dive, and then the remainder is predominantly built out of an almost 20% share of EBP mid-range, a very small subsegment of AV control, and then an other segment that is almost non-existent and is purely represented by double controller, double duelist SOVA setups. An important note here that I want to mention now before we go over any other region is that this isn't necessarily what we should expect out of the teams from this region. The teams that are representing these regions may be completely different from this metagame mix. What this represents is the field from which they came and what they are used to playing against. This is what you should see as this region's home turf advantage. So we can assume at baseline that Brazil is extremely comfortable playing against North American and double dive, double duelist type compositions. That can play a material role in their ability to adapt and overcome certain opponents that they may run into. Shifting over to EMEA, it should be no surprise that EU Standard is the most represented archetype. An interesting standout for Europe in particular is the fact that Astra Viper control is almost non-existent, there's a fairly significant representation of no duelist, and there is a massive 29% subsection of their meta that falls under that other category. For EU, their other category is mostly different takes on North American Standard and double controller, double duelist setups. So you have North American Standard where they're running Sky over Sova, North American Standard where they're running Sage over Sova, and then you have double controller, double duelist comps with both Sky and Sova as initiator options. The thing that should really be taken away from that big 29% block is that Europe's metagame is likely the most diverse on the planet right now. And that may not necessarily mean in terms of the number of different 5-agent combinations they had, but rather in terms of the number of archetypes that they have represented in what they have to play against. It's one thing to have to play 5 different versions of North American Standard. It's another thing entirely to have to play against 5 wholly different archetypes, and seemingly, Europe has almost every base covered in terms of what they've seen. Heading over to Japan, it will be one of the most balanced mixes that we'll see, with EU Standard, Korean Standard, Double Dive, EBP Midrange, and North American Standard all taking fairly equivalent segments of the overall mix. They do sneak in a little bit of triple duelist, and there's a fair bit of AV control, but overwhelmingly it is those standard archetypes that we see across the board and in fairly equivalent representation. Now on to Korea, we see an interesting phenomenon in that it has an almost identical blend to Europe if you were to carve out Europe's segment of EU Standard and instead divide that into equal parts across Korean Standard, Double Dive, and NA Standard. And while New Turn is the regional representative for Korea in almost an homage to their most famous team Vision Strikers, they are the region that has the most dive in their metagame of anywhere on Earth. Back across the Pacific to Latin America, we have another interesting mix that isn't like any other we've seen thus far. We have fairly large segments being dedicated to EU Standard and Double Dive, and when combined with Korean Standard and North American Standard, they have almost a dead even split between single duelist standard configurations and double duelist standard configurations. Where things get interesting is that over a quarter of their entire archetypal metagame is EBP midrange. LATAM has evidently been dealing with more drones over their Challengers 2 finals than anyone else could possibly imagine. In one other significant sidebar, this is also the largest meta segment of AV control that we've seen out of everything so far, and there's only 2 regions left to go. Dipping into North America, I think we have a mix that's fairly expected of the region at this point, with not a whole lot of single duelist representation, but 50% and change of double duelist. And as many analysts and community figures have pointed out, the far and away most Astra Viper control of any region around. As a matter of fact, NA takes that title by a margin of almost 2x. Finally landing on the last region, Southeast Asia, we see a model that's almost a direct copy of what we saw from Korea. The noteworthy exceptions being that you have to carve out almost all of the double dive and almost all of the EBP mid-range and dump both of them into North American Standard. Now that we've covered all of the region's mixes, this is where things get spicy. Here's a stack up of every region's home turf metagame. This is the field that each of the representatives had to fight their way through in order to book their ticket to Reykjavik. There are some pretty jarring differences between them. We see obviously EMEA with far and away the most EU standard. We see Brazil and North America with NA standard in spades compared to most of their counterparts. And we see an absurd amount of variance in the amount of experimentation that each region has taken with Astra Viper control. But what happens now when we compare that to the mix that we project we'll see at Iceland, assuming no dramatic changes in the compositions of the teams that are coming? We're no longer looking at the metas from which these regional representatives came, we're looking at what they're going to have to deal with come game day. And the scariest part is, it matches none of them. We see EU Standard and Korean Standard, the main single duelist compositional archetypes, taking just about 20% of the overall metagame. NA Standard will have its healthy segment as well at just over 20%, but it's when we get to the other double duelist archetype, Double Dive, that things really start to get a little crazy. If things go to expectation and we don't see any wild compositional changes the day of, there will be more Double Dive in Iceland than there is in any one region's home metagame. Rounding it out, we may still see a little bit of triple duelist and no duelist, and a pretty significant segment of AV control, and then there will always be that last little bit of other that's predominantly just a blend of standard non-SOVA comps that are pulled out on split. And while I said this didn't par up to any one region's metagame, that wasn't going to stop me from figuring out whose was the closest. And this was the ranking I came out with. If we adjust that into a top to bottom listing, it will surprise probably damn near everyone. Japan ends up the closest, and North America, Brazil, and EMEA, the three regions that most people expect to be the prime contenders for the top slot, are the furthest away. Now, major disclaimer, that does not mean that I think even remotely that Japan has a better shot than any of those last three regions. What I think this does is it gives us a really good baseline for what each region has in terms of preparation for each archetypal silo. For example, we know that Brazil isn't going to be thrown for a loop if they run into any double duelist setups from any other region. It is something that they play against day in and day out. Likewise, Korean teams are not going to be off-put by anyone playing dive because they basically wrote the book on it. The thing that will be most interesting to see from here is if any of those smaller archetype segments end up being overtly challenging for other regions. For instance, if someone's really effective with entry by proxy mid-range, e.g. Fnatic or Team Liquid, and it becomes a major hassle for other teams that don't necessarily have significant exposure to it. How about North America and AV Control? Are other regions prepared for that because it's not represented in their regions, and it's represented significantly enough in the Masters 2 metagame that if you're not ready for it, it will probably ruin your run? These are the questions that I still have, and frankly everyone should still have, because there is no concrete answer to them as of right now. The best thing you can do is look at how these compositions interacted with the metagames in their own regions, and the only sample that we have from that is the couple dozen games from each of the regional finals. And even all of this is still before you start talking about any sort of inter-regional mechanical differences. These metagame mixes serve as a great barometer for whether or not Team X will be surprised by Archetype Y. And I think it will serve as a fantastic tool to maybe have some bit of predictive edge when we're looking at the matchups that are expected to be more middle of the pack. All of the different second seeds, the Koreas, the Latin Americas, how those regions and those second seeds will par up against each other may very well be dictated in large part by their comfortability with the various metas. that will wrap us up for this one, and with Iceland now only 6 days away, I'm glad I got it out when I did. It's been a little bit rough recently. My team's been playing 2 tournaments a week for what feels like the last month at this point, and we've been doing fairly well, so I've been paying a lot of attention to that, but knew I wanted to get this out before the event itself started, so hopefully you enjoyed this information. Of course, I'll be pushing out everything that I can once Iceland starts, because I'm sure there's going to be more than enough to talk about. Per the usual, if you're enjoying my content, you can find me all across the interwebs at AnderzzTV, Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, you name it, I'm probably on it. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.